Hello. Um, so, over the last few days, ever since I watched that Jordan Peterson Kathy Newman debate, although really debate is maybe not the best word, it was Kathy Newman's failed attempt to interrogate Professor Peterson. I've been watching a lot of his videos. Now, I don't, I don't sort of worship anybody, right? So I don't idolize any individual, but I do think that there's been a strong resonance to what Professor Peterson is saying. A lot of the points he's making, particularly about the angle that postmodernism has taken and how it's affecting fundamental issues of liberty in the Western world, such as freedom of expression. I think a lot of people have resonated with that. And that's probably what explains his rather fast rise to fame and to acclaim. Because he put forward his points in a rational, coherent, and calm manner. And I think a lot of people find it very refreshing to hear a voice of reason amid such an ocean of virtue signaling, of people being professionally offended, etc., etc. Now, I'm not going to say I absolutely agree with everything Professor Peterson says. For one thing, I haven't watched all of his videos, so I can't make a sweeping statement like that. But I do think he makes some very compelling arguments, and he's definitely someone that's worth listening to. Anyway, with that as a pretext, there's a number of things I want to talk about, and I'll try and keep this video restricted to about 10 minutes or less. Firstly, on the Peterson-Newman exchange, interestingly, Channel 4 has already spoken about drafting insecurity because of the army of trolls that have apparently been attacking Kathy Newman. Well, I would treat this with a degree of caution, because what the regressive movement, for want of a better term, and I think Kathy Newman really showed herself to be quite a militant feminist in that exchange. What the regressive movement does when they lose arguments is play the victim. They put up this siege mentality whereby if you question us, that equates to threatening us. So I think what's probably happened is there has been a few idiots who have said things that shouldn't be condoned. Maybe they have made violent threats against Kathy Newman. Maybe they have even made, dare I say it, rape threats and so on. That's disgusting. And as Professor Peterson himself said, if people are doing that, they shouldn't. But what I deeply resent, and what was unfortunately predictable about this, is that because there was a lot of people supporting Professor Peterson in that exchange and criticising Kathy Newman, that criticism, very valid criticism, equates to abuse. The way I see it, Kathy Newman is a prominent journalist. She is a public figure. So she should be open to scrutiny as much as any other public figure. You know, within the limits of criticism. No threats, but criticism. And what I really have a problem with is the likes of The Guardian and The Independent are already distorting this. So instead of saying a lot of people happen to agree with what Professor Peterson was saying, and they happen to disagree with the obnoxious approach that she was taking, they're twisting it like alt-right extremists who support Professor Peterson are bullying Kathy Newman and threatening her online. And what they're doing is they're taking a minority of idiots and saying that every point of critique is therefore illegitimate. It's a bit like saying men who are genuinely misogynistic, i.e. they genuinely hate women, somehow represent every critic of modern Western feminism, which is utterly absurd. I mean, I using myself as an example, I like women. I generally get on quite well with women, and probably around half my friends are women. So I certainly wouldn't fit into the mold of misogynist in the sense that the word means hatred of women and girls. But I am very critical of contemporary Western feminism, as I've been clear about. Anyway, that's I'm aware of time here, so I want to be as concise as possible. What I really want to talk about here is both the left and the right, and why I feel that the left, more than the right, and I'm aware that I'm using umbrella terms here, but the left more than the right has been guilty of moving towards an authoritarian mindset. And by left, I'm not talking about every left-leaning person, not for a second. But I think it is crucial that people on the centre left are very, very assertive about this. And to be fair, some of them are. Um, anyone who follows politics and who identifies with the broad centre ground, in the States it would be called moderates, right, will have been looking at recent developments with all the geopolitical events that have been going on in the Western world, the rise of Trump, Brexit, etc., whatever geopolitical events you want to look at. And you'll notice that there's been a lot of vocalization, a lot of protests, a lot of counter-protests, right? Now, I happen to take issue with both left and right. And one thing I think those of us who are very, very wary of the regressive left, what we need to be careful about is not to just keep our focus on the regressive left, because there are extremes on the right, absolutely there are. We need to also be vocal about, for example, blood and soil nationalists, and yes, alt-right extremists. They do exist. And I think that's very, very important. But when it actually comes to totalitarian thinking in terms of, for example, censorship, that is definitely, definitely something that can be far more found in the domain of the regressive left. Put it this way, you might get people on the hard right who have some pretty unpleasant views. They might be racist views, they might be views that are pretty callous. I mean, I take issue with conservatives on a lot of issues. I think, for example, the American right is shamefully blind to the problem of gun violence. I think there is real issues in terms of how the regressive right, as I would describe them, view unemployed people and so on. There is certain thinking there that needs to be challenged. And I think people should be very careful. If you hate social justice warriors, I would urge caution in holding up someone like Katie Hopkins as some sort of cheerleader for freedom. She's not. She's just, well, it's my opinion, but she's just a pretty obnoxious and callous individual. I mean, anyone who calls other human beings cockroaches should not be held up as some sort of warrior for liberty. But that's not here or there. What I want to talk about is that you can point out, for example, how ugly the Daily Mail can be. And I hate the Daily Mail, right? You can talk about the Tories' callous attitude to people who are struggling, etc., etc., right? Those are all legitimate concerns. But when you look at certain power dynamics, if you look at the media and you look at universities, university is important because the ideas that are being generated in university and the situation of what's being tolerated in university does have implications, I think. I think Professor Peterson mentioned this, and I agree, does have implications further down the line. So the narrative that is being tolerated, basically, in university campuses today will have an implication on the political direction in 2030, 2035, 2040. And that causes real concern because without question, there is a deep, deep intolerance amongst the left when we look at university campuses across the Western world, in Britain, in the United States, and Canada. Um, I don't know so much about the situation in other European countries, but certainly there are examples of how this social justice warrior movement has become utterly intolerant. I mean, in Sweden, for example, there was a Swedish guy talking to Professor Peterson earlier, and he was saying the Me Too campaign has utterly dominated their media over the last few months, to the point where men are basically subverting themselves like, I'm personally to blame. And I think Professor Peterson is right to say that there is nothing more toxic than taking the problems of one part of a demographic and then laying the blame on everyone else. So the social justice warrior mindset is that if you're a white male, you are guilty. It doesn't matter if you're a left-wing white male, you're guilty by virtue of a demographic that you have no control over. And that sort of thinking is utterly, utterly destructive, because it dehumanizes people into being demographics rather than individuals. And if we look at what's happening on university campuses, I mean, I've just watched a stream of videos of Professor Peterson trying to talk. He has the patience of a saint. And aggressive, in-your-face, loud SJWs forcefully trying to close down his speeches. Now, say what you want about the right, but it's very rare that you will see, certainly not in today's context, possibly in the 50s, but in today's context, you don't see groups of right-wingers try to shut down a left-wing speaker, generally speaking. I am yet to see an example of that. You may get groups of right-wing activists be vocal, but in terms of the actual tolerance question, i.e. being allowed to speak, I do think that that is something that is definitely a lot more problematic within the left. And it's something that we need to be very, very wary of. I mean, my take on free speech is not like, oh, anything goes and you can hide behind free speech and not be accountable for what you say. I think people should be accountable for what they say. So if someone is being obnoxious, if they're being offensive for the sake of it, of course they should be challenged. But that's the beauty of free speech, that there is then the freedom to challenge them. And if certain trans activists, and it has to be said, they don't represent all trans people. Jordan Peterson said that. I know of many reasonable trans people who would not endorse those sort of tactics, where it's basically mob mentality of basically shouting until speakers drowned out. That's obnoxious in the extreme. But I'm stating the obvious here. I'll close with just a few thoughts. There is regressive attitudes to be found both the left and the right. But in identifying with the centre, if you ask me, do I want to be in a lecture hall where I'm addressing a group of, let's say, right-wing people on left-leaning ideas, or a group of left-wing people on right-leaning ideas, I feel I would get a more tolerant reception from the right-wing students. They might disagree with me, they might even boo me, but I think that in terms of the actual tolerance, yeah, the right probably is more tolerant overall. That doesn't mean I think everything they believe in is right or not problematic, but that is a very important thing. And what I've seen from Professor Peterson's talks really elevate. I mean, he's been put up to be an alt-right figure, right? And this is what the regressive left do. And I'm being careful here what I say. I'm not talking about the left in general. I'm talking about people who really force a sort of social justice warrior extremism onto university campuses. I really think that what they do is they pigeonhole you as being a right winger if you don't see the world exactly as they do. So if you don't endorse Antifa, I mean the movement, I'm not talking about the concept of being anti-fascist, I mean the movement, Antifa, then you're a fascist. You're with us or you're against us. That's the logic. And I really, really sympathise with any centrist students on university campuses these days and conservative students. I might not agree with their particular views, but I sympathise with them because it's a very unpleasant atmosphere when you have language police, when you actually, and Professor Peterson mentioned this in terms of the whole pronouns debate, when you actually have legislation being brought into it, then that's an authoritarian aspect where you're actually being threatened with fines or prison if you are offending people. That's sinister. That is sinister. There was a point in the exchange with Kathy Newman where she was saying, "Oh, but are you comparing people to Mao killing millions of people?" Um, I think Peterson probably could have elaborated a little bit more on that. I think he could have said, "Well, no, I'm not making that comparison." But she was trying to constantly catch him out, and she did fail, as I previously discussed. But it's not about killing lots of people. SJWs aren't killing lots of people. But that fundamental mindset is totalitarian, of trying to criminalize people who have a different point of view, of trying to violently shut down people who have a different point of view. You can find thugs on both sides, that goes without saying. But in terms of, for example, university campuses, definitely, I would say the intolerance comes more from the left. And that's just a few things to think about. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.